Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Samhar Araya, and on behalf of Facebook, I am so pleased to be with you today for a special conversation that we're co-hosting with the Africa Center. Today's conversation is a part of our Digital Diaspora series, a program that Facebook hosts to examine and explore the experience of African, Arab, and Turkish diasporas on our platform and how they use Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp to drive social, economic, and civic impact on our platform. On Facebook, I serve as the head of diaspora policy for the Africa, Middle East, and Turkey policy teams. And together with my colleagues, we're based all over the world. We focus on how we build relationships with people and users like you, and really understand how Facebook can better improve its product and our services so that you can maximize your connectivity, your community building, your relationships from wherever you are. We know that for diasporas, digital platforms are more than just a source of entertainment or learning. It's also a personal lifeline. It's a tool to help you connect to your heritage, to your culture, to your identity. It's a tool to help you discover what you may not have known. It's a tool to help you keep in touch with loved ones, no matter where you are. We also know that this is a platform that helps you explore your own histories, your stories, your narratives. And so today, we're so excited to be hosting this conversation as a digital diaspora series called Reimagining Ourselves, the Power of Storytelling. For the next hour or so, we're going to have a riveting conversation with two really wonderful people. I can't wait to introduce them to you. But before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping items. If you are interested in following this conversation or you'd like to share it with your networks, we invite you to use the hashtag Digital Diasporas. And also, we have a very short poll for you. We'd like to hear from you how you view yourself, if you identify as a member of the African diaspora. So much of this is about the discovery that each of us go through in determining where we sit in not only in the world physically, but where we stand emotionally, mentally, and where we find our purpose. And so for us, it's a question of not just curiosity, but care of how you identify in the larger African diaspora ecosystem. The poll is an opportunity for you to feed in. We also invite you to just let us know anytime. So with today's conversation, let me turn it over and begin to introduce our panelists. I want to start with the CEO of the Africa Center, Mr. Uzo Iweala. Uzo, are you there?
Hi, Samhar. Good to be here.
Uzo. Great to have you. For those of you who don't know, please allow me to share a little bit about Uzo's background. Uzo Iweala is an award-winning writer, filmmaker, and medical doctor. As the CEO of the Africa Center, he's dedicated to promoting a new narrative, about Africa and its diaspora. Uzo was the CEO, editor-in-chief, and co-founder of Ventures Africa magazine, and his books include Beasts of No Nation, Our Kind of People, and Speak No Evil. Uzo was also the founding CEO of the Private Sector Health Alliance of Nigeria, an organization that promotes private sector investment in health services and health innovation. A graduate of Harvard University and the Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons, of the Radcliffe Institute of Harvard University. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, my neighbor and my friend Uzo. Great to have you here. Hi, Uzo.
Yeah, it's good to be here. It's good to see you again.
Great to be here. Our second panelist, also an incredible person, our friend Ishmael Bey. You're a couple of hours behind us from the New York folks, but so good morning to you. For those of you who don't know, Ishmael is a Sierra Leonean and American author. He's written The Radiance of Tomorrow, a novel, and the memoir, A Long Way Gone, which was a #1 New York Times international bestseller. It's been published in over 40 languages. His third book, Little Family, is a profound and tender portrayal of the connections we forge to survive the fate we're dealt, and marks the further blossoming of a unique global voice. A UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, Ishmael lives in Los Angeles with his wife and 3 children. So we have a really interesting topic this morning. Um, and I'm excited about, your thoughts and your views on your experience as storytellers, as creatives, and just as voices, as parts of the African diaspora. Can you guys hear me okay? Sound, we're good? Okay. By now, you all should have gotten the poll. So if you didn't get a chance to answer it, uh, please let us know. But I want to jump right in here, and I want to make sure that we're able to get into all these wonderful questions. Audience members, you will have an opportunity to also ask questions. There is a Q&A box where you can submit questions, and we'll make sure to get to them during the portion later in the conversation. Okay. So I guess my first question, you all wear many hats. You both wear many hats, rather. But of the many hats, it's really clear that you have a creative aspect to everything you do. Uzo, why did you start creating stories, narratives, the spaces that you've created with the institutions you've started? And how has being an African who was born outside of the continent influenced your body of work?
Sure. It's a good question, and one that hopefully I can answer in a short period of time. I started creating, or like writing, I should say, when I was really young, probably, like 8 or 9 years old. And I did it just, in a very practical sense. I was a big Star Trek fan and was always like wanting to extend the episodes after I see Ishmael's face. He's like, what? Wanting to extend these episodes after watching them. But beyond that, I also grew up in a household surrounded by members of by books from the African Writers series. So that sort of idea of African fiction and African writing as a way of rendering the world around you is something that I think was part and parcel of my sort of growing up and my formative experiences. When it comes to being a creative person, recognizing that the power and strength of storytelling and its ability to shift or direct whole swaths of people. And I think I was seduced by that pretty early on. So I would say that my writing, while has always, it's always been, there's always been an affinity for the creative. It's never just been about writing for the sake of writing. It's always been writing attached to the sort of political power that it has, because that's the literary tradition that I think I was most exposed to when younger. And we can talk about that later. Now, in terms of some of the other creative endeavors, I mean, whether it's sort of moving into film and TV a little bit, or the idea of what we're doing at the Africa Center, which, just very briefly, institution in New York City, that comes out of the Museum of African Art. We're about 35 years old, but in our present iterations, the Africa Center, really very young, with the idea that it's one thing to be a creative, and this is my own personal interest. It's one thing to be a creative. It's another thing to create a platform and a space for other people who are practicing creative arts, whether that's writing, literature, painting, film, to bring all that together, because there's strength not just in your own individual expression, but also in the collective expression. I think that's some of what you talked about in your introduction, which is the more we unite as diaspora communities across the board, whether it's social issues or political issues or whatever, but I think also creativity, again, as a political force, is something that I find to be really, really important. And the more we can build institutions that are creative in their nature, the better we are and the stronger we are as a community.
I actually love the distinction you've made with people who identify as creatives and people who identify as the need to create the spaces for creatives. And that's such an important point and your body of work kind of goes into both, where you focus on institutions and platforms, and you've also used your own creative voice to contribute to narratives.
Yeah, and I think that's right. In some ways, I would say that the way that I've approached this is in some ways a blend of the people who I have most been influenced by, which is my parents, obviously being very practical Africans, being in the space of institutions and really working on institution building. And then also looking at some of my creative writing professors from college, or the writers that I was exposed to as a youngin in New York when I first came here, looking at how you again build platforms for creative talent that help to amplify the power of creative talent in the collective sense.
Yeah. And Ishmael, my question is sort of the same for you as in terms of when did you, why did you start creating, but also how has being an African from your homeland and going abroad shaped your work? I know you wrote your first book, the memoir, at a later point in life from as a reflective piece, but I'm very curious to see where storytelling and creativity came in to your life.
Thank you, Selma, for this conversation, and Uzo for this discussion we'll have today. I am, I think I'm probably a minority in the sense that I grew up even in on the African continent in sort of, if you want to, what's the word, the backwaters of society, really. I grew up in a very remote area where people did not know where it is, even in my own country. So I grew up with very strong oral tradition storytelling in a very Black African context type of way. My influence with any sort of Western ideas of telling stories were much later on in my life. So really my early formation of understanding stories and the impact of it was formed in a very old traditional setting, in a village where my grandmother told me stories when I was growing up as a kid and made me understand that stories are medicine that are poured into a human being to strengthen you so that you're able to face and deal with life, because life would always try to break you. So I came from that sort of, in my generation, I think it's very rare for people to come from that sort of background. Now, when I started to go to school and gain Western education, I was already very critical about the things that I was reading. And I started to understand that I wasn't seeing myself in the stories. I did not see a reflection of the type of places that I was coming from represented, even in African literature, that I was not there. So that stayed with me as a young child, but I didn't really consider myself a creative individual or that I could create something growing up, because as an African child, you come with the burden of your parents' expectations of wanting you to do all the things that are not necessarily about creativity.
Yes.
So it took me to go through the war that happened in Sierra Leone. And when I arrived in the United States, it's really when I started to think about writing seriously. And that came out of frustration about how people like me were portrayed, about how generally the issue of people like me were being written about in the world, And I remember when I first came to the US, I did not have anything but just a passport. I entered the country with just a passport, nothing, absolutely nothing. And so to even start school, I did not have a report card to show that I had been in school before, so nobody wanted to take me into school. So my first piece of creative writing came out of that necessity to show people that existed prior to when they encountered me. So I wrote an essay that was called Why I Do Not Have a Report Card, because most people wanted that to show that I'd been in school, even though I spoke English, even though it's not my language, I spoke it. It wasn't sufficient. So out of that, I realized how words for me had become sacred. That is the way I could have a representation of who I am or where I come from into the way people think about us, perceive us in the world, So that's how I started writing. And from there on, I think I really took the position to paraphrase Albert Camus, that the role of a writer, at least for me, it's not to represent those who make history, but rather those who suffer history. And I come from those who suffer history. So I wanted to really put our place in literature, in history, in the mindset, Black Africa, in the mindset of people. So they see the wisdom and intelligence that comes from that tradition that I just spoken about earlier. So that's how I started.
What's sitting with me on your answer, your insight is how much of this is about your visibility, your invisibility, and what you needed to do to become visible to the world that didn't know or didn't consider the journey you went on. And something as simple as a report card of being proof that you've been in a system and that you exist. You never think of life being diminished into a sheet of paper from a classroom, but it really is like for a child where you've been tracked is if you're lucky enough to go to school.
Yeah, in addition to that, I think for me also, while I've been writing, what I've started to realize is the fact that how there's a lot of emphasis on knowledge or wisdom as just what you gain from going to an institutional version of learning, right? As opposed to I came from a place where by the time I was a young man living in the West, I believed that I had a very sharper introspection into things because of my traditional upbringing more than other people. And in addition, because I've traveled also and knew how the Western world worked, I also had that POV. So for me, it was something that I wanted people to understand that wisdom and knowledge, it's not just for the upper class, even in Africa, or for people who are coming from a certain that knowledge is intrinsic in human beings, and anybody can have it anywhere. Like my grandmother was, I think, was a better philosopher than Plato or Aristotle or any of these people at all, in my opinion. And I strongly support it.
Well, I want to talk about that a little bit because the way you both started writing is from very different platforms or different venues. And Uzo, your first book was part of your studies as a college student. And Ishmael, you're emphasizing how tradition has really shaped your storytelling. I'd like to focus on tradition versus formal education a bit. How did that shape, Uzo, for you, having been in a classroom and submitting a paper, which became ultimately your first book? Where did tradition fall into place of the traditional forms of storytelling? Or did you find that the formal institution gave you room that you hadn't had before?
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky enough to be able to write a creative thesis. So my first novel, Beasts of No Nation, was actually my thesis from college. And with the leeway that's given to you as a creative writing thesis writer, it's within the English department. I think there was a lot of opportunity to explore, forms of storytelling. And I want to go sort of to something that Ishmael, you said, this idea of where knowledge is located. And I think the importance then of creativity, which is that it allows for you to bring knowledge from multiple areas into a certain space. Whereas, these areas might not meet in life outside of the creative space. If you're now bringing in, say, the wisdom of your grandmother, I would also agree with you in that sense, that the wisdom of elders, right? I think about my grandparents and sort of the stories that they told, the folk tales that they told. I think about that as having a profound influence on the kind of writing that I do. And if you look at some of the works that I have written, they are often filled with, in the tradition of some of our great novelists on the African continent, with that, as is the tradition of novelists anywhere, right? Like, or everywhere, those folk stories and that traditional wisdom comes into play in helping to construct and think through the themes that inform the narratives and the stories that I tell. Again, I'll go back to Chinua Achebe. If you look at his work, Things Fall Apart, the one that everybody knows. I mean, what is that if not, in many ways, a riff on certain folk tales? And if you even dive into the text itself and you look at the story of the tortoise and the birds and the famine and food, that in a way mirrors the whole story of Things Fall Apart, but it is also in and of itself the profound wisdom of elders that Ishmael talks about that has now found its way into this particular form of creative expression. And I think it's important to have both angles, to have that formal education, if you are afforded that opportunity. And I think, the main thing to really think about is who is afforded the opportunity, both here in the United States and also on the continent. But also, one of the problems I think we see in our various countries, and I'm Nigerian by origin, and I think that it's not dissimilar in Sierra Leone or in other places in Eritrea or across the continent. I think you see this real schism between, as Ishmael was saying, this idea of what is considered useful knowledge, which is the knowledge of elites, and what actually happens with people when they're forced to face like the real life experiences and that like of living. Let me take that back and say that like there are multiple ways of living. We just privilege the knowledge that comes out of a certain way of living, when that might not actually be the most important for taking us to where we need to be in our various communities and countries and whatnot. And I say that again, just with the idea that this is where creativity comes in most importantly, is that it creates a space where you could potentially have that knowledge of we'll call it the formal sector knowledge, and also the more traditional knowledge, and mix it up. And I think the progress is made when you allow for that creativity to happen. And it's not made when you start saying like, oh, it can only be done in this one way. I would assume that Ishmael is the same way. As a writer, your whole point of existing is to, in many ways, be like, you tell me it's done that way. Actually, no, I can imagine it differently. And that's where, again, it bringing in sort of past that other forms of knowledge and creativity is really, really important.
I want to talk about this storytelling aspect. I mean, you're both writers, but storytelling isn't limited to writers. And there are probably people watching who wouldn't know where to begin in terms of writing, but they have stories that they want to tell. So Ishmael, I want to hear from you. Who is a storyteller in your eyes? And what does it mean to reimagine ourselves?
I mean, I think, there are different mediums through which we can tell stories. It's not just through writing. First of all, I started with the oral storytelling, which the emphasis that I like to bring on that is that the power that it has is it really facilitates active listening. Because oftentimes people can read passively or they can take in information passively, but when somebody's telling you a story orally, they have to capture your imagination and take you to the space of the story in a way that perhaps the written word may not really do that, because you can rely on going back to page 6 if you didn't understand it, right? So when somebody's telling you a story orally, they have to have the visual element of the story as well, which is another way of telling stories. They have to spark your imaginative capacity and entrance and exits into the story so that you're there. So a storyteller is not just writing, it's about writing. There are filmmakers, there are painters. As we've seen on the African continent, we have all of these various multiple ways that people are able to express themselves, to talk about what it means to be Black and African currently. And even before us, as Uzo was talking about in the 60s, right after independence, you had a wave of other people who wanted to take back the way they had been portrayed in the world. So for me, I think it's, for a Black African person, for me, the most important thing that I want to ascribe, because this is what I care about more. I care about other people, but this is more important to me than other things.
Yeah.
I'll be very clear, is that over the years, we've given people the power to tell our stories. And therefore, we've given them the opportunity to even prescribe how we dream, how we think about ourselves, how we envision the future. And I think we need to take that back. And taking that back requires a vigorous and sort of almost militant way of talking about who we are, and not taking excuses at all. And I think for me, I want storytellers. When I think of storytellers, particularly from the African continent, Black diaspora, I want us to fit within that category. Now, this is not a limitation. I think this is an openness to create in different ways, but I think we need to be able to reclaim our spaces. We need to be able to take back our narratives. We need to be able to correct. There's a lot of correcting that needs to happen, and as we all know. So for me, these are the people that I consider real storytellers, those people who are trying to do that. Because again, story has to have a purpose. Creativity has to have a meaning. It has to have something that it leaves for the next generation to continue pushing further. It's not just to play around. So for me, that's what I think. But I wanted to say a little bit about, just briefly, about the formal education and informal sort of structure that you asked Uzo about, is that, again, leaning it into what I just spoke about creativity and about who are the real storytellers, is that, yes, it is good to have multiple ways of looking at information. As a novelist, I'm different people when I'm writing, I'm different characters. So that is very important. But what I'm trying to say is that over the years, I believe that, and for centuries now, there has been a belittling of the intelligence of the Black person. So to the point that I believe that when we start to reclaim and reimagine ourselves, we have to have that in the back of our minds very strongly. How do we make sure that that changes? Because people don't. For example, I've written 3 books. Every time I go to do a reading, there are still people who are very surprised that I wrote those books. They even say to me, "Oh, but your English is so good," even though I have written 3 books in English that they're standing in front of me to sign. So there's still a very conscious belittling of the intelligence of Black Africa, because we have not taken back our narrative. So for me, the formal education still pushes that. So we have Africans who are also helping to do that, because they think that Western knowledge is more superior than other kinds of knowledge. So I want us to really have a conversation about that.
I want to go there too, because
I just want to, can I
go.
jump in on something? Sorry, Summer. I mean, to the point, Ishmael, you were making earlier about like who is a storyteller. I think the thing I would just add to that, to everything that you said, is that there's a storyteller, whatever medium you work in, we all tell stories, but I think somebody who takes the mantle of storyteller is somebody really who has decided that they will practice a huge amount of discipline in this particular area. Because you can spin a tale, like whether or not your tale gets to people or what your viewpoint gets to people depends so much. And whether you finish that, the difference essentially between somebody who writes and the writer is that the writer sits down in the chair every day and says, I'm going to finish this book from beginning to end. Whether it's a good book is a different story, but the idea of being disciplined about how your message comes out, I think is really important. And I think, Ishmael, to one of the points you've been making about the way that we are viewed as Africans or diaspora people, I think there is a sense of not like we have the discipline to tell our stories, I think, but there's now, I think, a discipline in distribution of stories within this modern space that we need to also really think about in a very concerted fashion. And it's not just what stories you're telling. This is why I think the institution building is important. It's about what are the platforms that you put the stories on? Do you have control of those platforms, et cetera, et cetera? And I think that's really, really important. And it kind of, it goes hand in hand with some of the stuff that you've been saying about, are we challenging the whatever stories that have been put out there about us? I would take a step back and ask, do we need to look at it as a challenge, or do we need to look at it as just simply being? Is the question. Like, does it need to be a response? And in some cases it does need to be a real response, because there's stuff that is out there that you just need to slap down or smack out the picture. But also I think, again, I go back to the Achebe example where you look at his Things Fall Apart, where there was a way of writing that book that would have been a response, like a direct response to Conrad and colonialism and all that sort of stuff. And there was a way of writing the book, which is like, I'm going to just show you what the fullness of Black humanity is, and how that humanity is stressed when it comes into contact with the challenges that you meet in your everyday existence, but also when it comes into contact with something that no one has expected before. And that's the interaction, or the first interaction with colonial people in Things Fall Apart. And I think that's really, really important, that idea of showing and putting together stories that just show the fullness of who we are as Black people, as diaspora people, even whether those are happy stories or those are tragic stories or those are, and I think that is how you correct some of this this misconception that we aren't fully human. It's also about, like, being fully human means showing a full range of what it means to be human. And that's what one of the missions, I think, that is a fundamentally political mission. And I think that's one of the things that excites me the most about being a storyteller or a creative person.
Well, and that was actually my question,
add a little bit
was
just to
how,
that.
well, I was just going to say, to just close out that comment, both of you wrote about child soldiers and war and conflict. And for so long, that has been the stereotype that the white industrial complex, the white gaze focuses on. And yet you both managed to write these stories from a very authentic place, tell these stories in the most humane sort of fullness of the characters that you displayed. And then you've been able to go beyond that in your future, in your subsequent body of work. And I think that's the humanity that's the humanity I'm thinking of that you're referring to, actually, both of you.
Yes, I mean, just quickly to piggyback what Uzo was saying and then answer this question, is that I agree that there has to be two prongs. We have to write about who we are irrespective of the other, because that we want even our people to understand who they are and what their wisdom is, right? So Chinua Achebe writing Things Fall Apart, it was a great way to show fuller picture of what a Black Africa is, but it can be pushed more. But in addition to doing that, he also wrote an essay specifically on Conrad's book,
Right.
So I agree, everybody. So what I'm saying, that those two prongs need to be pushed 100%, because our responses cannot just be docile to show that we're human. We also have to full on take on certain intellectual spaces that have come to accept certain ways of thinking and feeling about us. And when Chinua Achebe wrote that essay about Conrad's book, a lot of people were not happy about it, but he was right about everything he said. Mm-hmm. He should have just said, well, I'm not going to challenge that because this is the status quo and things like that. It's part of the canonical work. But he challenged it and showed you the way people were trying to construct themselves vis-a-vis us by belittling us so that they can come out to be superior. We cannot allow that to happen as creators, as writers, as people who write very politically. We have to be doing those two things side by side. Now, to answer the question that you just asked Sema about writing, for me, when I wrote the book about my experiences, one of the things I wanted people to understand was the fact that when something happens to a child or anybody on the African continent, that person's survival of those situations requires a lot of intellect, strength, wisdom, and often we're not portrayed that way. We're just looked at as these kids who went through running around and this happened to them and they have a mental issue now and this and that. But tell me, what child do you know in anywhere in the Western world who will survive one day that an African child survives? An African child in the streets of Lagos, Sierra Leone, is an economist, a philosopher, an anthropologist, all at the same time in less than 5 minutes. They scan their environment. These strengths are not celebrated. So for me, when I wanted to write, I wanted people to see that, to understand this, to know that we can contribute to actually how humanity moves forward. Actually, I would go back. We have been contributing. Civilization started with us. Humanity started with us. But somehow we've been written out of discussions when it comes to that. Let's take COVID, for example, right? COVID happened. What part of the world that knows how to deal with pandemics more than anywhere else in the world? The African continent, where we ask for information, where we ask to talk about, we have more doctors from the African continent than most places, right? But nobody thinks of us as people who have ideas. It's because we're often a bit docile with our responses. We often allow people to just take, leadership positions ahead of us for things that we know more than them. And I'm really trying to challenge our generation to not allow that anymore, to start pushing those boundaries, Absolutely.
Yeah, so I'll push back on you on one thing, which is I agree with 99% of everything that you've said. I will say that I don't know about the docility though. I think that there's a real vocalness and a real political vocalness to Africans and those of us, like across the board in whatever space. And I mean, I think you see it like in the folks that have had their voices break through. I really do think one of our biggest problems is the lack of institutional capacity. And when I say institutional capacity, it doesn't necessarily have to look like what it looks like in other places, but I'm just saying the amplification of that critical voice, the amplification of the pushback and the platform to be able to do it on your own terms is so crucial, so that if you have a pushback, it doesn't need to be that you go to Al Jazeera or you go to the New York Times, which we all have to do in some ways to push back. Yes, you want to be able to write on those platforms and broadcast and push on those platforms, but I think you gain real power and respect when people are trying to get to your platforms to influence or make their case. And I think that's where, if we have failed in that. We have failed in the past in that sense because the deck has been stacked against us. But I think as we go forward, you're seeing a lot of people recognize that, realize that, and try to remedy it. Now, that's going to take a lot of time and it's going to take a lot of resources. And it's also going to take an insane amount of creativity to say, how do we build something that doesn't mimic, right? But that also that takes into account the ways that we process. So to go back to what you said initially, Ishmael, like the fact that so much wisdom and knowledge is contained in other stores, how do we figure out how to create platforms that reach people in that way and that use that wisdom as a way of, or an entry point for people to step into? I mean, I think there are a number of folks who think about this. I'm thinking of, he's a Zimbabwean history of science guy, Clapperton Mavunga, I think, who writes a lot about it, like indigenous forms of knowledge on the continent and also platforming and sort of how that's distributed. And I think, again, what it goes back to is you see those forms exist and you see that there's real strength in those forms. You don't see the ability to disseminate and push that knowledge. I mean, I think, again, going to what you were talking about in terms of COVID, you're right? The number of articles that you read, and I think Karen Attia at the Post wrote something about this, where she was like, what, did they just expect that we were all just going to die because of COVID? And everyone's so surprised that we're not all just dead yet. And she makes the point, Ishmael, that you were making, which is that if you look at people in Sierra Leone and what folks had to deal with when it came to Ebola, Sierra Leone, Liberia. You even look at Nigeria, which wasn't as didn't have the same issues that Sierra Leone and Liberia had in terms of the number of people dealing with the Ebola epidemic. But because we were able to do something that I think is phenomenal and fabulous, which is learn from what you guys were going through in Sierra Leone and Liberia, take stock, communicate actively. And what people don't think about was that there was an active exchange. There were Nigerians in Sierra Leone and Liberia working with doctors there, helping doctors there, learning from doctors there, so that when they came back and this thing came to Nigeria, there was a sort of shared knowledge that allowed for a very interesting and effective plan of action to shut it down. Now, people don't talk about that. Why don't they talk about it? Because the platforms that I think you would tell that story on are not interested in it, as you said, but that story exists. So how do we get it out, right? And I think, rather than leaving it as an open-ended question, we get it out by building the institutions for ourselves that will allow us to push those stories out in the various forms, whether it's big upping African artists or musicians or, writers like you and me, Ishmael. And I think that's a profoundly important political statement and focus.
They say that the strongest defense, the best defense is a strong offense. And I've always thought of that for narratives and representation from an African perspective, that sometimes we can be caught to the reactive body of work that needs to be done. But there's also just as much leaning in and creating, putting ourselves out in our own platforms. I want to build on that, and just noting the time for all of you in the Q&A. Thank you for your questions. We will be able to get to them in just after this question. But tell me a little bit about how the digital landscape has changed the ability of African storytelling, particularly in the diaspora as well as the continent. What have you noticed in the change or shift? Has there been a change or shift in storytelling from the diaspora, and what it's looked like digitally on social work, or however we've been using it?
I feel like a deer caught in the headlights. Ishmael, I'm gonna turn that one over to you.
No, I mean, either one. Because I know the three of us, we've all known each other for quite some time, and in the early mid 2000s, before social was available to everyone, storytelling was limited to a lot of these traditional platforms. But now there's just such a huge growth, an explosion really of storytelling across different platforms, different mediums, and different types of storytelling. And so finding each other online, this is one of the things that we really care about, is the ways in which Africans have found each other on the continent and in the diaspora, because of the ease of what technology has offered. Of course, there's challenges with that, and it's not always as helpful for some as they had hoped, but we're finding each other digitally in ways that I don't think we've ever seen before.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, sorry, go ahead.
No, go on, Uzo. I was gonna say, we'll take it, Uzo. So.
Oh, I mean, I was gonna say, I think that's right, and I think that there is an innovative way that folks are using some of these new platforms or media to tell those stories. I think most recently, what comes to mind is in Nigeria, the NSARS protests, and the way that people were able to not just organize digitally, but also construct a narrative about what happened on these platforms that might not have gotten out if people were limited to the traditional local newspapers or news channels that seem to actively work against getting, let me say this, some of them seem to work against getting out the truth of what happened, in Nigeria in October. And I think the folks who are driving those discussions and driving that creativity, in my mind, tend to be on the younger side, folks who have been exposed to these platforms from an early age and who understand just how powerful they can be. I think of the Kenyan comedian who is now a sensation. I've forgotten her name, so you'll have to forgive me. But who,
last name? Yeah, she's
right,
hilarious.
who's used Instagram, TikTok to just blow up and really bring out a whole new perspective on what it means to be, first what it meant to be in lockdown, and then second, just on all aspects of what life is like as a particular African person. I think of, again, even to go with comedians again, I'm sure you guys are familiar with I Am Dulo for Lauren Harris, who has his Instagram channel, which is the most ridiculous thing, but also one of the most incredible sort of storytelling platforms and forms of entertainment that this guy has crafted, again, in an almost like mixtape type fashion, taking taking videos from other places, overlaying new voice tracks, and showing how we reinterpret or interpret the world around us. And I think that shows you the power. And his reach, he's got millions of followers, and he's able to bring out all these ideas, making silly animal videos, but then occasionally you see him bring in a more political statement. You see him bring in an analysis here and there. And I think that's so important and so powerful. And that, I frankly, it's really awesome to be a part of that set of people, to learn from folks who are doing that with these platforms, even if, let's say, I'm not so proficient with them, as I get told by my young cousins, who, I think one of them said to me something like, Uncle Uza, your Instagram looks like the Instagram of a 30-year-old. And I was like, there's a reason for that. So, but seeing how those folks are bringing in their own ideas of what a story is and how story is modified and reshaped in this present moment is really amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, to add to that, the conversation we're having right now is possible because of that as well. I think, and everybody who's participating and listening to this conversation from everywhere around the world is possible because we have this type of technology, which, if you look back 60s, 50s, 40s, to gather a few people together to have a conversation around issues would be very difficult, where now we have those things. And also, when you look at the African continent in particular, we kind of skipped the landline generation, basically, and we went straight to mobile in a lot of places. So which kind of people find more usages for their cell phone because that's all they have as a tool. And so they're able to utilize it more, to do more with it than say for some of us who live abroad, who may have a computer and another thing, But still, I think we have to be, even though what Uzo said is really important, all these people are finding these new mediums to talk about what it means to be Black, what it means to be African, what it means to all of this. There's still a depth that we need to go further, so that it's not just about the numbers, about yes, creative ways to talk about the content, but it comes with a responsibility as well, how we present each other, what we do, things about. But I think it's also very good to see a liveliness. I want to see Uganda through comedy, not just through other things as well. So all of these facets are coming around so that we have a full 360 of the story itself. So we're not just, because we're human beings, so we're not just one dimensional as people have presented us over the years, right? We have multiple facets of how we react to the realities around us and things that are unfolding. But what I want us to be mindful about is also, as I mentioned earlier, I come from that bottom. Even when we talk about this democratization of storytelling that's there now because of technology, there are still some people who don't have access to that technology. There are lots and lots of people, and these are people whose voices are as important as ours. For example, in my country, Sierra Leone, if you try to host something on, I don't know, say Facebook or something, the person you're going to talk to from Sierra Leone is going to have some serious data issues to be able to have a creative conversation with you online. So we also have to be mindful to the fact that actually some of us in the diaspora have access because of where we live and the data spaces we can inhabit. So we have to be mindful with the spaces we are taking for those who may not have that data to be able to. So we have to be mindful when we talk about that, Again, storytelling, all of these things, I always think about it through the Ubuntu concept. I am because we are. We have to think about each other in everything that we do. How is it going to push the bar further? When I mentioned earlier, I saw a lot of people did not like that I said DOSA. I didn't mean we're as weak people. I meant our responses have been weak to how we are presented. They have not been strong enough. I think we need to really be truthful about that. I would make an example. For example, I was on a plane.
Uzo's thinking about whether he should respond.
No, I was just gonna say, Ishmael, I was gonna say you are.
Listen, let me finish. Let me make an anecdote.
You are the African dad, man. It's like you guys are okay. That was great, but you got an A. But where's the A plus? I don't see the plus.
Absolutely. No, we have to do that.
I want more.
Exactly, we have to do that because mediocrity we've seen doesn't help us. We've seen mediocrity doesn't help us, so we can't congratulate people on mediocrity at all.
Right.
And one thing we have to stand up for ourselves. For example, I was on a plane once. He was coming from Istanbul to Jomo Kenyatta Airport, and the flight attendant could not say Jomo Kenyatta. She kind of butchered it, and everybody laughed on the plane. I was upset, and I said we should correct her. Even in simple moments like that, that's why I'm saying our responses are weak. We allow people to butcher or to make fun of us of our blackness, and we don't stand up and we let it pass, and then it becomes accepted the way they do, right? So I think that's what I'm saying. Our responses have to be stronger, have to be militant. Maybe because I turned 40 today and I don't take stuff anymore. That's why.
That's right. Happy birthday.
So I don't
Happy
know, but
birthday.
I don't have time
Happy
for the little chit chats around. Is that?
But here's an example, Ishmael, and I do want to get to questions. We're running out of time, and apologies for having the technical difficulties at the top of the hour. But a question from Kevin about this issue. As you said, pronunciation of our own indigenous languages and names proves to be a challenge for some of our non-African friends, but we're saying, how does the language we use in telling our stories influence our impact of stories? So you're writing in English, but what if we were to write in the indigenous languages, or how has language diversity contributed or affected storytelling?
So I hope everyone has read Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind, where that collection of essays or talks actually talks a lot about the indigenization of our narrative forms. As somebody who grew up within the English tradition, who grew up in the United States, I think it's super important. And I think if you read through Ngugi wa Thiong'o's essays or his lectures, like, it gives you a really interesting and rich framework for how you think about it. I don't necessarily think that means that if you're not writing in indigenous language, you are doing harm, or you're somehow not supporting the cause. I think the other thing to remember is that, and this goes to Ishmael's point about the forcefulness, that all of this stuff, the point of creative expression is exchange, right? Is cultural exchange. And cultural exchange means, like, you're going to take in elements of all different aspects of the cultures you are exposed to. So if you grew up in the United States and you read in English, or you grew up in Sierra Leone, or you grew up in Nigeria, and your education was in English, and like, there's nothing wrong with, in fact, there's a real power in being able to take that language and manipulate it and change it and be creative with it to express, a sense of the world that you have. You think about Amos Tutuola, you think about Ken Saro-Wiwa, you think about Emmanuel Tongala, you think about Alain Mabankou, who writes in French. His book, what was now my brain is just like on fire right now, but
is it a recent one, Comrade? The new one?
No, it was, I wrote the introduction for his book, and this is bad that I'm forgetting, but it's
Black Bazaar. I can just call a bunch of them out.
Keep going. No, but it's the stories of the one with the drunk broken glass. That's it. I don't know why that just, but using like the way that he writes in French and the way that storyteller operates. And not just that, but the subject matter of the book, what he's bringing in, the stories he's bringing from France, the local stories, all told in French, a particular form of French, but it's about that exchange and that exercise. And are you approaching that exchange, as Ishmael was saying, from a position of power, right? Which is that you have command and control of the language, and also the ability to change and chop the language as you wish? Or are you coming into that worry that people aren't going to approve of your use of the language? And the writers that I admire, and the ones that I think have made an impact, say screw you to the way the form is supposed to be used, and take on the task of doing it the way that they want, that will express the world in the way that they see best. And I think the great African writers, whether from past or the ones that you're seeing today, all think about it in that way, or at least their writing suggests that they do.
Yes, I mean, I think, to add to that is that, when an African person or Black person speaks English or French or Portuguese or whatever the colonial language is, it's already been used in a different way. The words that we choose to use are different from the person who only knows English, because we come from so many other languages. So that in itself is already a revolution, in my opinion. But I do, for me, when I write, I'm always thinking, all my books that I've written, none of my characters speak English to me, even though I write them in English. All my characters speak Mende, Timini, Fula. They don't speak English to me. That's just how my mental space works. So I'm actually translating when I write. Now, what I'm always careful about, in the sense that I write through this colonial language, is the fact that this colonial language was imposed with a specific agenda to belittle how I operate in the world and how Black and I am in the world. So when I'm using it, I'm very aware of how I can change that as well. So for me, that's where I will end that. Yeah.
So it's interesting. What I love about this is you're both speaking to the power, the power that's innate in this, in the storytelling itself, in the act of storytelling, and in what we choose to respond to, and how we choose to respond. I'm hearing, using language of the colonizers isn't necessarily putting us at a weaker standing. It's actually, if how do you use that language to act to touch on the humanity and the depth of the characters or the story.
I mean, I'll just to add to that, I'll just say that there's something that happens when we like it's a weird, I don't know how to explain it, but there is no language that is not the language of some other person, right? And there is no language that exists purely in isolation from exchange, right? So if you look at the French and the German and the English that people speak, those languages are all the product of exchange, and then exchange over years and years and years and years, which is why you look at so many English words, right? The English language has so many references to French, right? You look at like French and Italian, all those like Latinate languages, right? And I think the same is true of our languages, which is like our languages are products of exchange internally within the continent and also externally. And that's a good thing, I think. I think that's an important thing, both politically and also creatively. Now, I think what is really, really important is also to make sure that we don't lose the power of the local, right? And that, like as Ishmael was saying, that's also incredibly important. And I say that just because the way that you speak also governs the way that you think, and it governs the way that you see the world. And so if you are trying to erase a language in a sense, then you are also trying to erase a worldview. And I think that's where what you're saying, Ishmael, becomes really, really important, which is, and like hearing you say that I think, or I hear these characters speak in a particular language or in particular languages, also makes me think that like those worldviews and that way of processing what's around you is so fundamentally important for the way that you then write the text that you write. And I think that just needs to be said, and it needs to be put out there that like that it's not just what it looks like on the page, but it's also the worldview, the patterns of speech that also inform how we interact and what solutions and creativity means in our places. I'll end by saying, like, you just think about Igbo proverbs, right, that people come up with, or the fact that my name is essentially a proverb or the beginning of a sentence. Like the way that we think about it is just like when you hear how like older Igbo men speak, introduce themselves, introduce a difficult topic, for conversation, that sort of thing. You also begin to see how our societies are structured, how then our like in larger sense countries are structured, and that's important because if we don't study that and are not fully aware of those things, then we will also not know how to put ourselves on the track towards whatever it is that we want.
Yeah, and where power lies, the power dynamics in the language we use, and what and in communicating our ideas and our thoughts and who we are, even in the how that's done implies so much power. Or there's a message for you to pick up around where power lies. I was just thinking as you said that in our culture, in the Eritrean culture, we use our first name, our last name, which is our father's first name, and then our grandfather's first name. So I have 3 last names. Samhar, Araya, Tsagai. And so you immediately know the lineage. That's supposed to tell you where you stand in the village or in the community. It's supposed to tell you so much about the person, as opposed to a last name that is in the directory to call. And those are some insights maybe we don't always, we sometimes lose sight of. As we move in the diaspora, there's some elements to power and what stories and how we tell them that exist in our cultures that we continue to uncover. I want to really thank the both of you for this conversation. I know we could have gone a lot longer, and I really wish that we had more time, but this is an exciting conversation that I want to continue again and again on the power of storytelling, and from a diaspora lens, from an African lens, from an African diaspora lens. We just really appreciate hearing your insights. I think the audience has been dropping in a lot of comments around how exciting this is, and you guys got a lot of points, and Ishmael, you've got a lot of birthday well wishes from our listeners.
I think we should sing Ishmael happy birthday.
I think we should. We should. Before we hang up, just for those of you on the call, another question for you on the poll. We would really love your feedback. There's a few question that's going to pop up on your screen around what you thought around the event. If you could just take some time, quickly click on it, that would help us. Do you agree that this program was informative, engaging, and thought-provoking? strongly agree to strongly disagree. That would be helpful for all of us as we continue to host these conversations. Um, Ishmael and Uzo, any last words before we conclude?
Since I am the elder in this, I will start. In this
Mm.
fashion. Going back to our tradition, I really want to, for everybody listening, to all of us also here, I want to leave us with a challenge, which are the ways that I'm thinking these days. And the idea is really to think about who we really are as, not as Africans, but as Black Africans. And I would challenge people to start reading the work of Sheikh Anta Diop and people like that who have done incredible research to try, because I think one of the problems we've had through colonialism and even before that is this failure to really discuss what Blackness is as Africans. I think Africans always avoid Blackness to their identity. We see colorism on the African continent. We know that it's not, our contact with our Blackness and understanding of it didn't come about because of slavery or because of other people. We are aware of it. And I think I really want to challenge people to start thinking about that, because if we don't know who we are, really, we're not gonna, all these conversations are sort of not gonna go anywhere, really, in the sense that it's not gonna embody us in a way that's going to be sustainable for the future. So I want people to really think about that. Blackness in Africa. This is why I refer to myself as a Black African person. I don't just call myself as an African. What is even Africa? Who gave us that name? That's another conversation. But
That's another one. Thank you, Ishmael. Thank you, Uzo.
I mean, my elder has spoken. That's all I can say.
What can we say? We agree. We agree. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for giving us your time. Thank you for your patience at the top of the call. This was also streamed on Facebook and Instagram. So to our friends on the platform on Facebook and Instagram, thank you for joining us and staying on board. We look forward to having you join us again. And a special thank you to the Africa Center for really partnering with us on such an exciting topic. Everyone stay safe. Have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you soon.